Sam, thank you. President Trump will land in Vegas tonight ahead of an event tomorrow touting his tax break initiatives.
And ahead of that visit, the White House is releasing new data saying Nevada is seeing a surge in jobs and private investment tied to the administration's economic policies. White House officials point to billions in new projects, including national investment plans from Apple and Amazon that include Nevada data centers and fulfillment facilities, as well as an $80 million Crocs fulfillment expansion in Las Vegas. The administration says, combined with enhanced opportunity zones and other tax relief, these moves have protected about 64,000 full-time jobs over 4 years, saved $10 billion in state GDP, and safeguarded $5 billion in wages. And the Nevada State Democratic Party is pushing back on those claims. Danielle Monroe Moreno shared a statement this week saying, in part, quote, Nevada's economy has one of the worst unemployment rates in the nation, and Trump's policies only threaten to keep that number growing as tourism and travel to the state continue to decline. President Trump will speak at Red Rock Resort tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. Count on Fox 5 Vegas for coverage on air, online, and our free Fox 5 Vegas Plus streaming app.